The speakers in this video are Laura Wyckoff, Duha Beg, Mary Ogborn, and Maria Castillo. We will be speaking about gender, class, ethnic, religious, regional, and other group identities and how they changed in different eras. Period 1 begins with pre-Columbian society. North American tribes saw themselves as groups distinct from each other, not as a part of a larger body of Native Americans. The men usually spent their time making tools and hunting for game, while the women grew crops. Few tribes developed a complex culture and society. The arrival of Columbus initiated lasting contact between people on opposite sides of the Atlantic. This touched off a transatlantic trade known as the Columbian Exchange. Spanish and Portuguese explorers and settlers developed colonies using natives and enslaved Africans for labor. Natives and Africans resisted oppression by maintaining elements of their culture. Because few families came from Spain to the Americas, explorers and soldiers intermarried with natives and Africans. Rigid class systems were developed, dominated by pure-blooded Spaniards. On the other hand, in English colonies, marriage with natives and Africans was less common, as entire families typically made the journey. After the decimation of native people from violence and disease by the Europeans, the Native Americans adopted new ways to survive and were never able to return to the life they had known prior to 1942. Transitioning into Period 2, settlements struggled to survive, but they became a society of permanent farms, plantations, towns, cities, and ideas for governing the Americans. They all sought to dominate the native inhabitants who had become an obstacle for the American colonial growth. The Virginia Company hoped to meet labor needs through indentured servants. In the beginning, Africans were imported to serve as indentured servants and were not bound for life, neither were their offspring. Because of people's inability to purchase the Africans, Virginia House of Burgesses enacted laws that discriminated between Africans and whites. Africans and offspring were to be kept in permanent bondage. They were slaves. Many immigrants who traveled to the Americas were trying to escape religious persecution and would go to places like Maryland, known for its religious tolerance. All colonies permitted the practice of different religions, but with varying degrees of freedom. Massachusetts, the most conservative, accepted several types of Protestants, but it excluded non-Christians and Catholics. Rhode Island and Pennsylvania were the most liberal. Class systems were narrower and were mainly based on economy. Family was the center of life. Men usually worked, and English law gave the husband almost unlimited power in the home, including the right to beat his wife. Women usually bore 8 children, performed a wide range of tasks, educated their children, and had limited legal and political rights. Many merchants belonged to the Church of England. Because the Church of England was headed by the king, it was viewed as a symbol of English control in the colonies. A major event during this period was the Great Awakening, which was a movement characterized by fervent expressions of religious feeling among masses of people. It was strongest during the 1730s and 1740s. This had a profound effect on religious practice in colonies. Another major movement was Enlightenment, 18th century. In the 18th century, some educated Americans felt attracted to a European movement in literature and philosophy. A major influence in Enlightenment thinking was John Locke. In Period 3, after the 7 Years' War, Britain desired more revenue to pay for protection of the empire. However, many Americans saw themselves as self-sufficient. The colonies entered into war with Britain in 1775. About 5,000 African Americans fought as patriots. The American Revolution was seen in some ways as a civil war, as it divided Americans between anti-British patriots and pro-British loyalists. Members of the same family sometimes joined opposite sides. For example, while Benjamin Franklin was leading the Patriots, his son William joined the Tories. American Indians tried to stay out of the war, but attacks by colonists prompted many to support Britain. The war profoundly changed society. It weakened aristocracy. Many states adopted the principle of separation of church and state. War. Many patriots depended on active support of women. In some instances, women fought, taking their husband's place, such as Mary Macaulay. Their most important contribution, however, was maintaining colonial economy. Despite contribution, women remained in a second-class status. Unanswered went the pleas of Abigail Adams to her husband, John Adams. Slavery also became essential to the economy and was justified religiously and politically.
From 1800 to 1898, America and its gender, ethnicity, classes, and religious groups experienced many changes. As a result of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, Native American tribes kept being pushed farther westward in the name of manifest destiny, as whites kept pushing for more land. Nationalistic feelings increased amongst groups during the War of 1812, but the Missouri Compromise led to a major shift in regional groups. Although Missouri entered as a slave state and Maine as a free state, it signified true tensions between the North and the South. The South developed into a cotton-producing area with Eli Whitney's cotton gin, and this led to an increased dependence on slaves. The North was mainly manufacturing, and which led to more organized labor and had 50% of all free African Americans. During this time, women did not have many opportunities to work, and slavery was still a legal institution. There was also a huge surge in immigration from 1830 to 1860. One group was the Irish, who settled in cities in the Northeast because of low funds and limited special skills. Germans, who had more wealth and more interest in farming, went to homesteads in the Old Northwest. This surge in immigrants led to a rise in nativist sentiments, mainly by Protestants. Those on the frontier had to do everything themselves and were the self-made families, and women had shorter lifespans. The Second Great Awakening of 1820 occurred as a reaction against rationalism, mainly through appeals to emotions and fears of damnation. This led to the Baptist and Methodist religions growing stronger and for the Mormons to emerge. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 ruled that Indians could be removed in order to allow for more white westward expansion. Although the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia gave them the right to sue, the Worcester versus Georgia case allowed the removal to be legal, in which case Jackson took the side of the states and authorized the removal of Indians. In addition, the cult of domesticity emerged, in which women were in charge of the home. However, the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 and the Declaration of Sentiments showed a movement for women's suffrage. Another anti-slavery movement occurred, which included black and violent abolitionists. Many tried going about it in peace, such as the black abolitionists, but the violent abolitionists were not afraid to attack other places, such as Harper's Ferry. The war with Mexico deepened sectional tensions as more territories were added and the debate of slavery was brought up again. The Compromise of 1850 only just prevented the Civil War until the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which brought up the issue of slavery again, especially considering Bleeding Kansas, in which many people were fighting as to whether slavery should be in Kansas or not. Dred Scott versus Stanford ruled that many African Americans had no rights and that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. The South finally left the Union in 1860 with the election of Lincoln. Slavery was ended in 1862 with the Emancipation Proclamation and the passage of the 13th Amendment. Women stepped up to work on plantations and in factories during the Civil War, as well as nurses on the battlefield. However, once the war ended, they left their jobs in order for men to go back. This still had an effect as it led to women to consider nursing as a career, and to start another movement for their rights. After the Civil War, black codes in the South restricted much of the freedoms gained by African Americans, but radical Republicans also passed the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to every person born in the United States, and later the 15th Amendment, which granted the right to vote, as well as the poorly enforced Civil Rights Act of 1875. After the absence of radical Republicans in the South, white supremacy rose up, and the rise of the KKK prevented many of the rights for African Americans. With industrialization came an expanding middle class, especially in white-collar jobs, and more women working in the textile and garment industries, although they were mainly young and single. This also led to the rise of organized labor against intolerable conditions, such as the American Federation of Labor. In 1882, the government passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned all Chinese immigration to protect jobs for whites. More conflicts occurred with Native Americans as the westward boundary kept pushing. This was such as Little Bighorn in 1876 and Chief Joseph in 1877, as well as the Goats Dance movement in order to battle white supremacy and westward expansion. In 1887, the Dawes Act was passed, which divided up tribal land and also sent many Native American children to white boarding schools in order for them to be assimilated. As a result of the Mexican War, many Mexican Americans became migrant workers and preserved their Hispanic culture. Segregation was still very strong in the South despite many laws, and lynchings, grandfather clauses, and others were allowed to prevent African Americans' rights. In 1896, the Plessy v. Ferguson case stated that if it was separate but equal, it was constitutional and legal. In 1890s, new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe came over to America, and they were largely Catholic, Orthodox Greek, Orthodox, or Jewish, who faced resentment but were able to assimilate into the culture of America. Distinct ethnic neighborhoods formed in cities and preserved their culture in these so-called neighborhoods called ghettos.
In Period 7, we witnessed the disenfranchisement of African American voters. As a racial group, blacks were still subject to heavy discrimination. Although African Americans were granted the right to vote, there were still many implications and obstacles. For example, in February of 1901, the Virginia General Assembly authorized a constitutional convention to draft election reforms. The convention, supported by Democrats, aimed to disfranchise African Americans without violating the 14th and 15th Amendments. The delegates to the convention considered poll taxes and literacy tests as requirements for voting. The convention passed a new constitution in 1902 that required voters to pay a poll tax or pass a literacy test. There was also the ever-so-popular women's suffrage movement. Women, already in the 20th century, have always been an integral part of the familial schematic, yet are still unable to choose their leadership. The fight for equal rights and opportunity met opposition. People believe that if women gain these rights, it will hinder their ability to be good mothers and caregivers. Taken from a women's suffrage poster in 1915 is the following quote: "She can clean her own rooms, but if the neighbors are allowed to live in filth, she cannot keep her rooms from being filled with bad air and smells, or from being infested with vermin." Japanese internment was also a major issue. Responding to fears of Japanese spies within the United States, President Roosevelt signed an order authorizing the forced relocation and confinement of more than 110,000 Japanese nationals and Japanese Americans living in the West. The Japanese, similar to the blacks, were subject to heavy marginalization and were ostracized from society. Period 8 brought the civil rights movement. As seen in Period 7, where African Americans, subject to racial bigotry, fought for their complete voting rights, the movement expanded to include the awareness of the black struggle. Martin Luther King joined the cause alongside Memphis sanitation workers who went on strike for better wages and working conditions. Speaking to a crowd of 6,000 in late March and returning on April 3rd to deliver one of his most famous speeches, "I've been to the mountaintop." King placed the strike in larger context, declaring, quote, "The masses of people are rising up, and wherever they are assembled today, whether they are in Johannesburg, South Africa, Nairobi, Kenya, Accra, Ghana, New York City, Atlanta, Jackson, Mississippi, or Memphis, Tennessee, the cry is always the same. We want to be free." An example of group identity changing in Period 9 would be that of acceptance. Built as a divider between East and West Berlin by the Communist East German government in 1961, the Berlin Wall was torn down to widespread celebration on November 9th, 1989. The destruction of the wall signified the fall of the Iron Curtain and symbolized the end of the Cold War, but also displayed the fight for group identity. The Germans were sick of being divided and therefore sought unity.
Throughout these time periods, identity has transformed from the regional differences from New England and the Chesapeake to the emergence of America as a major world power in 1812, to the sectionalism preceding the Civil War, all the way to women breaking gender roles with the 19th Amendment and receiving the right to vote. Over time, these identity developments resulted from anything from religion to economic needs to personal motivations. Evidently, the identity of America is constantly moldable and always changing.